Great. I think we might make a start. I know people are still trickling in via the waiting room, but we do have a really tight schedule today and lots to get through. So for all those that are in the room so far, thank you for joining us today to launch Missing Young People in Australian News Media, a report that examines media representation of young people during the first 6 months of COVID-19 in Australia. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and the custodians of the land throughout Australia on whose unceded country we conduct our business as an organisation. We pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging. And I would particularly like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging there. And I also extend a warm welcome to any Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people who've joined us today. I am Mizzy Tolhurst. I am the Youth Media Centre Lead at FYA, and we are super excited to show you our findings and to engage in a robust conversation about media representation and media literacy in Australia. We hope that what we present today can inform future research that seeks to make our media more equitable and participatory for young people. Some housekeeping. We will be recording this, so if you don't want to be recorded, please turn your video off. We will distribute the full recording at the conclusion of the event, in addition to a copy of the full report if you do need to pop out or can't stay for the full hour 15. If you just want to see the panelists and me, hide the non-video participants, so you've just got the panel of us in front of you. And we won't tolerate just some house rules, bad behaviour or nasty comments, and if you want to go down that path, we will remove you from this event. We're here to have a productive discussion. The Q&A will be run through the chat function, so please, as questions pop up, put your commentary in there, and if you'd like to direct a question to a particular panellist, just note the name of who you're directing it to. Those we can't get to, we will endeavour to answer after the fact and share with attendees as well. We are tight on time, as I mentioned, so I'm also going to be doing my very best Jenny Brocky and interjecting if required to keep people on track and on time. So don't take it to heart, it's just a way of keeping us on track and keeping the conversation moving. For those who don't know a lot about the Foundation for Young Australians, we are a national not-for-profit who believe that young people have the power to beat injustice and transform the future. We take seriously our role in that, which is to back young people with the trust, resources, skills and connections to make change. Our report serves this role by identifying some of the problems with how the media engage and treat young people. Today, with an absolutely stellar panel of young people, journalists, editors and media literacy experts, we want to dig deeper into the why, understand why is it happening and examine the opportunities for change. We've also decided to launch our report in Media Literacy Week, which is an annual global initiative gaining momentum in Australia that's designed to combat the spread of misinformation and expand people's comprehension of information more broadly. We see the findings in this report as innately tied to media literacy. That is, an ability to understand bias, detect agendas, decode symbols, demand credibility in news, and understand the power structures, particularly in Australia, that are in play in our online news media. But we will examine this in a bit more detail in the panel discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to take you through the preliminary findings of our report. Young people are so keen to raise climate change, but are deaf to the COVID-19 danger. This is a headline from a news item published between the time period we analysed, February 1 to July 31. And it gives you an indication of how we went into this analysis. And that was really with the assumption that a headline like this is often how young people are portrayed by the media. So we really wanted to test, especially during COVID, a time when young people have been disproportionately impacted by something outside their control in a global event. Was this assumption correct? Is a headline like this really indicative of how young people are represented, or was this our own bias as a youth organisation coming out? So this is what we did. We, in a first of a kind analysis for our organisation, we established a baseline for understanding how often young people were talked about by Australian online media. We searched online content for keywords about or synonymous with young people and found that out of more than 10 million articles, around 338,000 were about young people. This means that young people make up only 3.3% of content given in the time period analysed. Despite being disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and it having ramifications for all aspects of their life, articles about young people actually declined from the same time period in 2019. And of the content that was published in 2020, only 45% related to COVID. From establishing this overview of youth representation in the Australian online media, we were able to zone in and examine more deeply published by 6 mainstream news organisations. They were ABC, SBS, The Australian Financial Review, The Age, The Herald and the Herald Sun, including syndicated mastheads for the latter 2 publications. So we really tried to pick 6 that covered a range of publications and connected with a lot of readers. But in this analysis, we not only searched for the presence of keywords, but scrutinised where the quotes from young people appeared, how many quotes appeared, and how claims, particularly those made in the headline, were substantiated in the article. This analysis revealed that across 6 publications, 59% of articles that mention young people in the headline were not supported by a quote or a case study in the body copy. So what we denote here is that young people are often talked about, but not very often or rarely talked to. To make matters worse, not only are young people talked about and not to, but stereotypes were often used in the portrayal or coverage of young people across these 6 publications. Stereotypes are a form of bias that can impact public perception and how policies are made or not made for young people. Importantly, they can also influence young people's perception of themselves, depriving them of agency that can emerge in other parts of their life. So in this analysis, we looked at 685 articles across the 6 major online news publications and found that almost 50% of articles about young people included one of these 5 stereotypes. The Australian was the leader of stereotype use, using them in 75% of coverage about young people. Millennials, you can't unfollow a pandemic. This is another headline that we felt brought to life this analysis, or was, and typified the research undertaking we'd done in this section. And yes, we acknowledge that some millennials are a bit older than young people, but what it highlighted was that 3 in the body copy beyond this headline, 3 negative stereotypes in that list of 5 were used, and that was that young people are lazy or lack resilience, they're unable to make the right decisions, and they're entitled. It also didn't feature any youth voice or representation from a member of that generation. For more information or to understand how we applied this stereotype analysis and how stereotypes were used by each of the 6 publications, see the full report. But what we posit from this analysis is that it's hard not to see that there's a correlation between lacking engagement or declining engagement and trust in the media and the use of negative or offensive stereotypes. So the question we ask is, and on behalf of young people, is why would you engage with media if it doesn't accurately reflect you and your lived experience? But what we continued to find as we went through our analysis is that this is not just a problem for young people. Our analysis also revealed that how the media talks about you depends on your age. In this section, we use conventional generational tags, baby boomer, Gen X, Gen Y, and Gen Z, to understand how coverage varies based on your age. These tags cover the Australian population aged 11 to 74, and in using them, we acknowledge that they don't capture the great diversity within age groups that exists in our community, but they are labels that are commonly used to describe people by age. So we recognise the limitations of this, but have used it nonetheless as a way of looking at the differences in coverage. This analysis also didn't consider how intersecting issues of class, race, gender, or socioeconomic status impact your representation in the media, but this is something we would absolutely love to do in future editions of this research, because we recognise that has a huge impact as well. So for this analysis, we looked at 518 articles across 5 different areas and broke them down by generation. We analysed for sentiment using a spectrum model and according to this criteria. So positive articles were those that were favourable to a generation or included substantiated claims and quotes from members of the generation. Negative were on the other end of the spectrum, where articles were critical about the generation and did not include evidence or quotes about them. and neutral articles were those that were balanced, featured evidence and sources or quotes and case studies from the generation in question. We also, it's important to acknowledge here, and I'm sure we'll dive into it as we get into the conversation, but actually the importance of neutrality in news coverage. This is what news coverage by and large should be, treating people and subject matters objectively and free of bias. In this analysis, and for the area of economic wellbeing, we can see that 71% of the articles about Generation Z were critical of them and lacked quotes or case studies about them. The report covers 4 other key areas: climate change, housing, education, and First Nations affairs. In more detail, should you wish to understand this analysis more deeply. To flesh out the methodology, here is another headline example of one of the economic wellbeing articles. It demonstrates that, according to our methodology, a positive story does not necessarily denote a good news story for the generation in question, but that this article has been classified as positive because it included young people's voices and experiences in the story through use of quotes and case studies. In the story, an image of a young woman, one of the interviewees, is also included, and the journalist references speaking with dozens of young people between the ages of 24 and 39 who shared stories of their struggles finding work and building long-term wealth. This has really been just a snapshot of what is in our quite lengthy report, and to fully understand our analysis and methodology, we do encourage you to immerse yourself in the findings of the full version. But our report really closes by making 5 key recommendations to the media. 1, to collect data on youth voice and representation in your newsrooms. 2, to include quotes from young people in the news coverage and stories, particularly where young people are mentioned in the headline. 3, to make use of intermediary organisations like FYA, like the YMCA, like youth peak bodies in every state and territory who can provide fast and reliable access to a range of young people with diverse experiences for inclusion in stories. Number 4, that young people are more employed in newsrooms, and that in a post-COVID world, we look at reimagining cadetships and internships to provide more paid opportunity to young people. And number 5 is to start a conversation with us about making the media more representative and ideally continuing this research so it can include and go deeper into some of the elements we've discussed. The conversation element is really important, as I said, because this was like a first undertaking for FYA. So we really are keen for the future iterations of it to be deeply collaborative. So here's your call now. If you have any suggestions or a way you'd like to work on the future editions of the report, please get in touch. With these findings fresh in our minds now, I'd like to engage the panel, including 2 data analysts on hand to answer methodology related questions. But this panel is now where we're going to dig a little bit deeper into understanding why some of these findings might be the case and where the solutions lie. I'm going to start with Annabel Astbury, the Head of Education at ABC, and note that you are a driving force really of Media Literacy Week in Australia. But I wonder for you, what is the role that media literacy has in solving some problems or addressing the challenges raised in the findings here? Oh, you're on mute, Annabel.
Classic move. Media
Got you now.
Thanks so much, Izzy. I think before we start delving into analysing some of the problems, I think it might be useful for the audience to perhaps understand a little bit more about what we mean by media literacy. So when we talk about media literacy is the ability to critically engage with the media in all aspects of life, you know, how you encounter it every day. And that includes the ability to access, to analyse, to evaluate, to create, to act using all forms of media, whatever that may be, including the news media. And today we are focusing on the news media. And we think it's really important that these competencies and skills are taught explicitly and really called out specifically in the school curriculum. Having this means that people from a young age will be able to value the importance of media literacy, and it will ensure that they continue to develop those skills as they become adults. But I do want to say just at this point that lack of media literacy is not just sort of seen in young people. We see it across all generations, and that's why we see media literacy as being integral to lifelong learning and to having the ability to participate in a democratic society. The newly formed Australian Media Literacy Alliance, which is comprised of some of the most esteemed cultural institutions across Australia, has created a framework for teaching and learning about media literacy, and you can find that at medialiteracy.org.au, and I might pop that in the chat there later on, or if someone can do it now, that would be terrific. So with that in mind, we can see that good media literacy education can solve problems that have been raised in the report that Izzy has touched on. I think one of the first problems that is raised is lack of youth voice and representation. A media literate person engages with media representations with an understanding of how processes of selection and construction have been used to create stories according to particular points of view. So they engage with and they know how to find information. They know how to find information such as this report to understand how news media is constructed, how news outlets attract audiences, and how news is structured, and how to question media. Media literacy education gives you the skill to question or interrogate media with questions such as, well, why aren't young people represented in the media? And it's because of these skills that you've gained in a media literate school or through a media literacy education, you're empowered to go and act and create responsible media and to make sure that it's that the imbalance is corrected. A second problem that the report highlights is the way that news media stereotypes young people. Again, it comes back to media literacy education, which has taught students to produce their own news media by using good journalistic practices, such as using verifiable facts and avoiding generalisations and stereotypes to present such information in an objective way. I have a little bit to say about that, and perhaps later on, maybe in the questions, about I think there is an overall, overarching problem within society about people misunderstanding what public service journalism is. A media literate person knows, though, that stereotyping is not a hallmark of great journalism, and they can identify it as such. So hopefully when they create their own news media, they avoid the trap of stereotyping other groups as well, such as boomers, for example. And that's, I work obviously with a schools audience, and you know, I see that sort of stereotyping happening as well. Lastly, there's that problem in the report that it highlights that young people are rarely quoted in the news media. And I can see that news media literacy can help here if it's implemented from a young age, especially during the school years. I think this is just very crucial. If young people at school are empowered to act on issues that are important to them and to create their own news media to amplify their voice, then they'll continue to act and create as they become older. And hopefully, you know, that continues as they become a responsible citizen in society. Media literacy education fosters this action and creation of media as much as it teaches them about their roles as being consumers of information. So that's a sort of that in a snapshot where I think media literacy education can sort of actually answer and address some of these problems. And I'm happy to take at the end some questions if any come through.
Thanks, Annabel. Moving on to Sean. So Sean Tarek Goodwin is a freelance writer and an intern at The Age. So you are often charged with implementing good journalistic practice and source checking and fact verifying. You have written a significant number of stories about young people during COVID, trying to understand how they're faring, and you included multiple voices in those stories. So tell us a bit about this process. What did they add to the story, and why, to your mind and to your editor's team, were they essential to be included?
Yeah, thanks, Izzy. I'd also like to start off by acknowledging that I'm dialing in from Gadigal land and pay my respect to all elders past, present and emerging. But yeah, on that topic, for these stories, I think the key is good case studies and good voices. It makes any story, in my view, more powerful when you have people who are impacted that can speak for themselves, and it's just more connecting in general. So there are two main stories recently that I've worked on around young people. One was for The Guardian as a kind of generation coronavirus check-in, and the other one was more recently about how young people are faring and how budget announcements were relating to them a couple of weeks ago for the age. And for that story, I think we just started off by trying to get as many voices as possible and trying to make sure that we're very conscious of that they're not all from one group, that they're a diverse and accurate representative cross-section of young people that kind of, you know, looks a bit more like the society that you see every day. So yeah, throughout that process, we ended up getting in touch with and interviewing 9 young people, being conscious throughout that to make sure we had a good balance of a representative balance of genders, ethnicities, geographic locations, and an age spread within the youth demographic was really important. So the outcome of that, you know, we had those 9 interviews. I interviewed them all before the budget announcements for the age and then again after. And the outcome of that was that then when we didn't end up using all of them, but when we boiled it down, I felt like we were quite confident that the stories that we did tell, that were balanced and were able to, even though there were just 2 of them in the end, they were able to represent that kind of broader scope of young people. So we funneled it down to Karina and Pravin and just used their voices. And we were confident that those were the right voices, got good photos of them so that people could connect with them and with their experience. And then for that story, then I chased down a bunch of other leaders from industry and retail and hospitality, interviewed a macroeconomist, threw in a lot of statistics. And at the end of the day, I think that kind of cornerstone of having really good case studies made the story really effective. And, you know, I woke up the next day and it was on the front page, and that was my first front page story. So it was a real lesson for me, and, you know, a big boost for me to show that, you know, when you put the work in, and you try and find good voices and good case studies, it takes a lot of work to find and track down, you know, 9 young people and be conscious that you're getting, you know, a good spread. You know, sometimes more work than a lot of journalists are able to do with time constraints. But I was really happy at the end of that we ended up, you know, with a really strong story, and it's something that I'm really proud of and will continue to be conscious of as I go forward.
Thanks, Sean. You've raised a really good point about the role of lack of resources and declining funding, etc., which I have no doubt plays a role into this, and greater representation across a range of groups. But we'll hold on that one and come back to it later, hopefully. But someone who's often on the other side of the microphone or the voice recorder to Sean, and that is Sophie Johnston. You are a commissioner at the National Youth Commission Australia. You're often, as I said, being interviewed by broadcast media, print media, online media, and being called to speak on behalf of all young people. Many may recognise your face from the Q&A edition Young and Free, where you were but the only young person on the panel. And I wonder how do you respond when you're asked to speak on behalf of all young people?
Thanks, Izzy. And I'll just note I'm on Ngunnawal land today, and I'd like to extend my respect to elders past and present. So for anyone who missed the Q&A, the whole idea of the panel was to look at how young people had been disproportionately affected by COVID-19 and by the pandemic and the loss of hours and the skyrocketing of unemployment. And I was the only person under 25. I was also the only person under 30. And what this meant was it kind of became, instead of raising the profile of these issues that young people were facing, it turned into, I guess, me having to debate and validate and defend the circumstances of young people. And so the pure fact of not having a diversity of youth voices and having only, you know, one young person on there, it just completely changed the dynamic and the intention of the panel. And I'm often asked things like, you know, how are young people responding to this? How do young people feel? And you know, through my work, I can do my best to provide observations, but it really does. It takes away the autonomy of so many young people with so many diverse experiences. You know, I get asked about, you know, how apprentices are feeling, how people from regional and remote areas are feeling, how Indigenous young people are feeling. And it's disappointing because I don't feel like we see that across other generations when we're responding to specific issues. It's like all young people are lumped in together. Whereas, you know, when we're talking about the other issues more broadly, we don't sort of see that play out so much. And I think what part of the problem is that, you know, when we want to talk about the economy, we get an economist to come and talk about the economy. But when we want to talk about young people, we don't see them as being experts. And I remember Hamish pulled me aside after Q&A and said, look, I'm sorry we didn't throw to you for the first question. And I was expecting that they would. I was waiting there thinking, you know, being the only young person, they're probably going to throw to me first. So I was prepared for that. But he said, I thought you were probably nervous, so we didn't want to, you know, throw you into the deep end straight off. And in my head, I'm like, well, I'm on this panel too. I'm on here just as every other panelist is on here, and I'm just as prepared to be able to respond to these things. So I think there's a bit of a lack of trust in young people's ability to be experts on these issues, and I've felt that in the confidence that you know, different producers have had before I've gone on to a radio show or a brekkie show or something like that.
Thanks, Soph. And I think this idea of tokenism is problematic as well, but again, is something we can perhaps dig into in greater detail in the Q&A. Patrick Lenton, you are the editor of Junkee. This is a media network that features young people both as storytellers and as the subject of their content and stories. But how do you find a balance between making news accessible and providing young people access to stories of national significance or importance? So talk us through that editorial process a bit.
Thanks so much, Izzy. Yeah, I guess that one of the big issues that we have is that, like, as a news organization, we would love to probably cover as much as we can, except we have a tiny team, and we also have, as opposed to a lot of other news organizations, a really defined demographic and audience, which is young people. So we're able to actually cherry pick exactly what stories we want, which are always things that are either about young people or important to young people, or going to affect them. So a huge part of how we do that is making sure that we write news in ways that young people not only understand, but is written for them. So using references and context that young people actually understand. So one of the probably more immediate ways that that manifests is just even in the copy of our news reports, our tone is lighter, it's more informal, it's funnier, it's, you know, even like, you know, obviously we'll take serious things seriously, but like it's very likely that we'll, you know, include a couple of like, you know, jabs at politicians who we don't like. That, you know, will like, we were recently referred to, I recently had a new writer come on board who worked in traditional media before this, and he got so excited when he was able to refer to Daniel Andrews as Victoria's daddy. And it's just like little things like that, which, you know, aren't necessarily necessary for young people to understand, but it does help them understand that we are translating the news to them in a way that is specific for them, using their language, using their references. The second thing, and Sean really touched on this as well, is that from an editorial stance, we really believe in finding the right voice and the right person to write about a certain issue. So we try not to kind of write about things that that we don't have the authority to write about. So we do a lot of coverage of like underrepresented or marginalized communities. And as the editor, I always reach out to writers who come from that community or that background to write that perspective, because I feel like young people get talked about a lot, but rarely get to actually talk about themselves or talk about their issues. And because all of our writers and all of our news pieces are about young people, it means that we don't always reach out specifically to, you know, a young person. We reach out to a very specific type of young person from the community or the group that we are trying to give a voice to, you know, and that's a huge sort of part of our kind of mission here, which is basically to boost voices of young people, because as this whole report and as everyone's sort of showing, young people rarely are getting that voice in other sort of places. And then the last point is that how do we sort of provide access to stories for young people of national significance? Our editorial balance across Junkee, once again with a really tiny team, is that we're not just doing like the important news stories. We're a pop culture and entertainment and politics publication. So the things that we believe are important to young people are also the things that entertain them, and, you know, they find funny, and you know, currently being the story in entertainment. So we kind of maybe we don't take it all as necessarily as seriously as each other, but we do seriously believe in providing news and stories and voices about like all those things, and not just kind of politics. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thanks, Patrick. You've provided a really neat segue in talking about your defined demographic and also the critical importance of representation of different demographics and voices to speak on their own behalf, which is, I believe, a perfect segue to Shahni Wellington, presenter and journalist at NITV, which, as many would know, is a dedicated channel made by, for and about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This is, I think, a powerful example of an outlet that has committed to greater representation of First Nations people, but has committed just, you know, to doing that. And I wonder how you engage First Nations young people in stories, and you've mentioned in past conversations with me about just how integral they are. So tell us about how that process works at NITV.
Thanks, Izzy. Hello, everyone. I'm Shahni, and I'm a proud Jurrinja and Wandyan woman, and I'm coming in from Camaragal country in Sydney. And getting to those things, I just wanted to start with you know, that journalists are very much trusted to deliver the news to the public. And just listening to the report and people speak, I just wanted to start with that, you know, that hurt and that anger that many people feel when a story that you're the focus of and you're not included in that. I just wanted to say that those feelings are validated, you know, and that's an experience that a lot of Aboriginal people, a lot of Aboriginal young people and young people in general feel all the time. So I just wanted to say, you know, that how that experience of going through that, you know, you're not whiny young fellas like a lot of the stories that we're talking about make you out to be. Those feelings are valid. And there's a mantra that we say a lot of mob live by, and that's nothing about us without us. And I think that rings true in a lot of the things that we're talking about here. And I think that, like you mentioned, young people are so integral to our representation on our screens and in our stories, because representation means empowerment for a lot of us. And in my experience at NITV, not only are young people capable of speaking for themselves, but they're often on the front line. You know, we've seen this year with Black Lives Matter and climate justice, social justice, you know, raising the age of criminal responsibility. These young people are at the centre of these issues, and so without having them in these stories, it really takes away and makes our journalism lesser, especially, you know, speaking from my perspective. And sometimes that doesn't come across in many of the, as we've seen in this report, in a lot of the stories that are being told. And I think a lot of that comes back to bias, which I'm sure that we've all encountered at some point, and there's layers of bias. And speaking from a First Nations perspective, we're talking about how media deals with diversity of background, of age, of socioeconomic factors. And in my own experiences and understandings, that can just be a fancy word for racism or many other things, systemic racism in our newsrooms that we see. And if that's not transpiring as racism. It is just, you know, gender bias or age bias and things like that. And we've kind of seen a reckoning this year about how the media deals with that, with diversity. We're having reports like this. We saw that report by Media Diversity a bit earlier, and we're kind of seeing that there needs to be a change in how we think about telling our stories. And like I think Sean and Patrick mentioned, it does fall back on us, and being able to go that extra mile and not sacrificing the quality of your journalism for a deadline, because we are, you know, I'm here to learn as much as I am to have a yarn with you, Mob, because we've all been on deadlines and needed to get the story done rather than do it in the right way that it should be told. And so you weren't able to get the talent that you wanted because it had to be done in, you know, the next hour in order for it to make the bulletin to be told at all, which, you know, we trying to have to make that, deal with that dilemma of, will we get the story, or will we get the story with the right talent, the right people saying the right things? And so that's something that we have to deal with, and especially as a First Nations reporter, you know, Sophie mentioned, you know, young people don't speak for all young people. So it's also about, there shouldn't be that pressure to speak on behalf of everyone, and going about it culturally appropriate ways. So you do have the right people telling the stories, and we do need to do our groundwork. So I guess that was a long roundabout way of me saying that young people are so integral, and, you know, I'm here to learn about how we can engage better with young people and communities, so we can ensure that we're doing the stories the right way, because I know how myself and many mob out there know how it feels to not be included and have these stories told about you without you.
Thanks, Shahni. And I think that point of about us, nothing about us without us, also stems into another conversation, which also brings back the media literacy lens around trust in media, and increasingly where people don't see themselves, they turn away. So throwing back to you, Sean, I wonder, you know, both as someone who is young, but also who's working in the media, it's true of much of this panel, but how do you think media representation of young people is affecting young people's trust and engagement with the media?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it starts with representation, as it does, you know, with any kind of cross-section of identity. That, you know, when you see people represented, then, you know, you're more likely to connect with that media. And I think that starts in the newsroom, in terms of giving young people a voice in the newsroom, and a strong voice in the newsroom. Often, you know, my experience at the Age has been really positive, but I know that across the industry, people coming in, being given a shot is so rare and so tenuous that it's, you know, people need to feel like when they are in the conversation, they can pipe up and say something when they want to. So I think that that's something that, you know, that the industry in general has to be conscious of. But, you know, I think, you know, when young people do have a voice in the newsroom, they're naturally going to start reporting and pitching the stories that are impactful and interesting to young people. And when those are done well, they'll feature the voices, and that'll improve that representation for people, and bring more young people into that. I think part of it is, you know, the representation of what we're talking about. But another big component in terms of connecting with young people and building their trust is also focusing on how we're talking, how we're reaching young people. And I think there's a lot of organisations in Australia that are really conscious of engaging with young people in the ways that they consume media. I think that's really important, and something I'm really passionate about as I build my career, is making sure that I'm being as digitally focused as possible with my skills. And I think a lot of young journalists, you know, who are wanting to come into the industry are. You know, I was talking to a friend the other day, and I brought up something that happened in the news. And she said, "Oh, I haven't listened to any podcasts today, so I'm not across that. Could you kind of explain it to me?" And I thought that was a really good example of how young people are consuming media, and how, you know, they are going beyond the headlines in many ways. And a lot of programs are helping them do that, but doing that in a digital native way. Like, for example, Triple J Hack have some fantastic explainers that they've built in Instagram stories to help people get past the headlines. So I think connecting with young people in terms of the representation, putting their voices out there, which starts with kind of involving young people in that process, but then also doing that in a way that is conscious of how they're receiving media. They're not necessarily always just tuning into the bulletins, they're getting their news in many other ways. I think that's how the industry can kind of leap forward and improve how they do that.
Excellent. And to speak to someone who works at an organisation that has almost 100% representation of young people, Molly George, you're the social enterprise manager at SYN. So I think I'm going a bit rogue here. This is just a tack onto your scripted question, but just around, I think, thinking about the mediums, like meeting young people on their mediums, how are you seeing that play out in developing young people's engagement and trust in the media? So your whole work, the whole organisation exists to upskill young people in media, but how are you seeing them do that on platforms of their choosing?
Thanks, Izzy. And first, I just wanted to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Wurrung and Boorlong language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, acknowledging their ancestors and elders, past, present, and emerging, and sovereignty was never ceded. I think in regards to your question around platforms and how young people are engaging, I think one thing is really clear to us at SYN is that young people aren't necessarily choosing to engage in traditional mediums, in obviously newspapers, and news bulletins on the television. It's much more based around social media platforms. And I think that the reason why we're seeing that is because it's a platform that allows young people to control their own narrative, to control how they want to relay that information, and to control how they want to engage with it with other young people. So it's a much more community-based response to what's happening in the world, and also using it as a tool of mobilization in a lot of ways. And I think that that's sort of one thing that quite often gets discredited in that sense. And when it comes to media literacy, I know talking about social media and not getting your news from social media is a really big issue there. And I'm not going to sort of brush over that, but at the same time, I think that it's less about sort of, I guess, what you're reading and more about how young people are able to own that and really engage that. And I think just to sort of echo, I guess, what Sean said, it was more about, employing young people and enabling them to have a voice in those newsrooms, to have a voice in the media, to actually share their own perspectives in an authentic way. That's what we're not seeing currently in the current media landscape from a majority of traditional media landscapes. And so that's why young people are creating their own dialogue on TikTok, on Instagram, on Twitter, and really taking ownership of that. So that's one thing that we've seen to be really clear, especially over COVID. And I think just to sort of, I kind of follow on a little bit about what Sean said as well, at SYN, we're quite often asked, you guys are really good at engaging young people. How do you do it? Why do you do it so well? And I think the one thing that we've definitely made a priority for the last 17 years and has been unwavering is that we're a youth community station with a broadcast license by young people for young people at all levels. So that's our at our board level, within governance, at the staff level, with all the volunteers. And, that's a really radical model. We understand that. That's not going to work for every media outlet, but that's the reason why we're so good at engaging young people, because we've given them the control, the platform to be able to share their own stories, their own narrative in their own voice. And that's really, really powerful.
Thanks, Molly. I mean, everyone here would, I think, be in agreement that increasing representation of young people has its merits, and that's probably a strong enough reason on its own. But this doesn't just have to be an act of altruism. So to Patrick, I put the question around, based on your own experiences of Junkee, what are some of the commercial benefits for media outlets doing better engagement with young people, and contrarily, what are the costs of ignoring them?
Well, I think that kind of goes back to what we were talking about with engaging young people on their platforms. Like, from what I understand of an advertising perspective, like, young people are known as the unreachables because it's so hard for, brands and services to actually advertise to young people using the traditional media that that they tend to use. You know, young people don't watch television, like they don't watch free to air television. They don't, you know, they don't listen to commercial radio. They don't, you know, like all those sorts of places where the majority of ad services go through aren't actually places frequented by young people. So if you engage with and grow a youth audience through media, if that's how you're trying to, like, you know, sell your ads, and that's actually one of the only ways that you can do it. You know, like youth are not just like digitally savvy, but like incredibly I guess like social media engaged, but also really smart with how they consume it, you know? So so if you become a trusted voice for them, you know, digitally, then I guess the benefit would be that, like, then consumers can start putting their, brands can start putting their ads on it. We've also, I was reading the other day that, like, millennials as a group are incredibly distrustful of advertising and savvy in the sense that, like, they don't like to be advertised to, so you have to kind of hide it, you know, and speak through like voices that they find engaging or interesting, which sort of gave rise to influencer culture. You know, that's kind of how you get advertised to as a millennial, by being like, oh, I like them, so therefore I'll buy the terrible thing that they're advertising to us. But Gen Z actually is weirdly, like, surprisingly brand safe. They like brands because they feel more like they're so digitally savvy that they actually feel more empowered to make the right decisions around it. So, like, so if they think that a brand is doing the right thing, they'll make that decision, which kind of leads to the rise of, like, you know, ethical brands and all that sort of stuff. So if you're able to talk to young people and know that, and therefore have an engaged young audience, talking through their channels, talking through social media channels, then I guess that's one of the I guess more cynical benefits, I would say. But I also reckon it's so, just in terms of, like, actual journalism and actual, like, stories, we are seeing more and more that media is polarized between generations. You know, like, we are definitely seen as part of that, because, you know, like the whole discourse around you know, boomers and like, you know, Karens and all that sort of stuff, like, that's a huge part of our reportage this year. But, like, I think the important thing to note is that we're not leading the charge with that. We are reflecting what young people are talking about, because they feel attacked by traditional media, which, you know, is always talking about them and attacking young people. So when they sort of start attacking back, you know, we report on that. So by doing that and not engaging a young audience and in fact attacking them, they're losing that audience entirely, you know, like, and it just seems short-sighted to me, because eventually they're going to be the, you know, they're going to be the people with the money and the families and the, you know, and the, like, the traditional audience for that media. So.
And Shahni, throwing back to you, we've talked about the commercial gains and broadly the gains for young people to be made from having greater representation, but what do you see as being some of the community gains in your experience? And does that dissemination of trust or feeling adequately represent pervade communities? What's been your experience?
My experience, I think communities thrive when, you know, there is representation and they have more engagement with youth and, you know, communities in general, but it's about showing them that they matter, but also that there's public interest in the positive stories, because as we've seen, and I'm sure a lot of this the report shows, is that a lot of the articles that are most successful are usually detrimental. You know, they're talking about, you know, youth suicide rather than the the work being done behind the scenes to address the rates. You know, it's always in that kind of negative arena, and those are that if you're, why would you want to engage with media when that's they're the only stories that are being reported on and are seen as successful? And I also think it's about, you see, when you have more representation, when young people are being employed, you're seeing it as a viable career. You know, when I was young and I would engage with media on TV or on the internet, I never saw Aboriginal reporters reporting on the Aboriginal stories. You know, there were always people on the rounds that have been doing it for many years, but they never had that lived experience. And so a place like NITV, or when we do have, you know, ABC Indigenous and these kind of units that are showing that we are capable and we have that representation in the mainstream and in these networks, it's just kind of showing that our stories are important, even when they're not, you know, blatantly negative. Our positive, the good things that we do also resonate. And so I think that's also a big social impact in our communities when you see these stories being told. And I wanted to talk about one kind of little case study really quickly. We saw, I think it was last week, about, you know, vigilantism in Townsville, about the young fellas and the laws that are being proposed. And, you know, speaking freely, there is a target audience for that campaign, and that's young Indigenous kids in Townsville. And I think hardly any of those stories actually involved a young person talking about how that would affect them, which seems ridiculous to us, but that's how the stories were told. But in involving young people it's not going to be detrimental to stories. It can also be really powerful. If anyone's seen Duane Hussein, the young Aranda boy who went to the UN and talked about his life experience and how raising the age of criminal responsibility would affect him. And that's what made that story sing, you know, because people could see in real life how these laws have, you know, affected a young fella, and how the Western system of learning and criminal responsibility doesn't mean that he's, you know, he's trouble or he's uneducated in that way. And the way that we tell stories needs to shift, because the way that communities engage with media, it's not going to be worse off if we are able to tell these stories in a different kind of way. We just have to kind of put the resources and the abilities into and the right people in the right jobs in order to do it in the proper way.
Thanks, Shahni. And I think this is the essence of the report, isn't it? Like, put people's voices in there, and we can paint a clearer picture of stories of our community, of our society, of the issues that they face, and help inform the policy decisions and the discourse around that. So with acknowledging the criticalness of having young voices in the story, Molly, I'm going to throw to you and wondering about identified leadership positions for young people in the media. So you are the youth board member of the Community Broadcasting Association of Australia, the CBAA. So what do those positions do to bolster youth representation, or help? How do they impact and shape media?
It's a great question, and I think it's a big question because I sort of feel divided in a lot of ways about it. So in general, I think leadership roles are really important for anybody who is marginalised to be able to have an impact on any industry they're representing. And I feel really privileged to be able to sat on the board of the CBAA as the youth rep, and I am that for the next couple of weeks. And to be able to have my presence and perspective known and heard on that board. So I think one of the ways that I've been able to champion young people for the community broadcasting sector has really been about focusing, I suppose, ultimately on really good governance practices. So as the youth rep every year at our annual conference, which is happening right now, we have a youth forum. So basically I run the youth forum. I speak to young people that are able to come to the conference and hear their voices and views on how they're represented in the sector. But then from there, the channel of communication on sharing that with the board is kind of lost. There's no formal report. There was nothing like that. And so a lot of what I've focused on has really been about, we have young people here. We are an aging sector. That's an issue, especially when it comes to volunteers, young people being unable to volunteer. How can we then foster that? And so it's been more about how we're actually hearing, engaging young people in our sector, and how I can make this role a more authentic role within the community broadcasting sector, to be able to make it easier for young people coming into the role post me to be able to share that and have an impact. So I think I just want to mention within this that youth positions can have a really big impact, but I don't think they are having a really huge impact in the way that they should, and for the simple fact that they are seen as youth positions. And I think that when you say that, it instantly puts that young person in the position in that box of, you're a young person, you're here to represent young people, and that gives a whole stigma that their contribution isn't necessarily valued past what they're bringing for young people. So it's not authentic, you know. I think the one thing that, I guess, one criticism, and I'll say this publicly because I've said it to the board and to the CEO many times, that this is a non-voting position, but I'm publicly elected. And I think that just kind of shows the level of separation that the value of this position has, and also, I suppose, the impact that it could have if it was voting. And given that it's publicly elected by young people, how does that show that you're authentically showing those young people's voices? Before I finish up, I think I just want to mention, because I noticed something in the comments I think is really important. Somebody mentioned about when it comes to speaking to the media and media training for young people to be able to better speak to media. And I think that that's a really important way to support young people in those positions. But the one thing that I will mention is that the young people that do often get into positions like leadership, like sitting on a board or speaking to the media, are the ones that can sound like an adult. And I think that is a really big issue. We're not great at fostering young people and speaking to young people in their own language. And I think that media training would kind of better bolster them up to be able to sound like adults. But ultimately, I think that we need to be better at speaking to young people, like young people, valuing their voices in that authentic way, because just because they might not be as eloquent as other young people doesn't mean that they don't have something important to say and don't deserve to share it in their own voice.
Really well said, Molly. Annabel, we're going to come full circle to you, and I suppose we're headed towards proposing some solutions or looking at ways to do better on some of the problems that have been raised in the report. And I wonder what you see as some of the tangible solutions, both from your experience in media broadly, but also as a media literacy expert. How do we up the participation of young people in Australian news media today?
Well, I think I'll just start with echoing Molly's point there at the end, is that, and I will come from a point of view where I work with a lot of school-aged children, and for the ABC, it's very hard. We deal with younger students very well. Primary schools we deal with very well. Almost everybody I meet, when I say that I work with ABC Education, they immediately assume that I have something to do with Behind the News, because it's just such a sort of, landmark, program that everybody across so many generations has been exposed to. But when it comes to that age group, for that secondary school age group, sort of 11 to 15, we know that audience does disappear. And I'm very keen to engage that particular audience. And I think what happens, as Molly was saying, there is a condescension there that is taken, an approach of condescension taken towards young people. And also, about the way that we train them to, talk to the media, or have an expectation, or broadcasters have an expectation that what an 11-year-old student or a 12-year-old student or a 15-year-old student produces has to mimic exactly what they see on the YouTube news feed that comes out from any of the national broadcasters or any of the major news outlets. So I think that is actually a problem. So one thing that I would like to fix, and a tangible solution, I don't think it's about creating new services for 12 to 15-year-olds. I'd really like to put 12 to 15-year-olds or 12 to 16-year-olds in the creator's seat and create the news on the platforms that they want for the audience that they know, not for an adult audience, because I think there's nothing creepier than a news organisation or a news outlet creating a new news show for young people that basically comes across as, something that's just been replicated for an adult audience. But just to go back in terms of the solutions, just to go back to the start where you were talking about some of the recommendations, one of the recommendations of the report was that newsrooms across Australia could examine their own coverage of youth voice in their news cycle and ensure fair representation and to avoid stereotypes. I definitely agree with that. We try to do that at the ABC by including youth voice through programs like Behind the News, through youth voice, through some of the articles that we do on ABC Education. But there's also that the Haywire program that the ABC runs out of ABC Regional and Local, which actually focuses on 16 to 22-year-olds for the Haywire storytelling program for people within regional Australia to come forward and share their stories and to help develop their own voices and skills as storytellers. And then the Trailblazer program, which focuses on that older group of 18 to 28-year-olds to sort of share their stories as well. So I think that's one way that, we can continue with programs like that. But that's not only just from the national broadcaster. I think that should be the responsibility of major news outlets who are not just necessarily catering to a youth audience. I think that the other, solution forward or recommendation of the report was that journalists need to include young voices in their representation of views across the society, but especially where the headline refers to young people. And I think when Shahni was speaking before, I was thinking about also about the inclusion, and Stephanie, referred to this before. It's about having young voices in relation to things that might be important to them, but they might not necessarily be initially affiliated with. So that example that Stephanie gave about, not being asked about the economy. Of course, young people, have opinions about economy. You don't just have, a young person's view. They can have a fully formed view of other issues that might not just specifically relate to them, but of course they can contextualise it. And the other recommendation, to make use of organisations who can provide fast and reliable access to a diverse range of young people for inclusion in the stories, and such as, SYN Media, such as the Youth Media Centre from FYA. I think you can do it through programs we can see it through the BTN audience as well, and I know it's a much younger group, but I still think it's important to sort of raise these issues at a very young age as well. You may have seen earlier in the news, I think this is a responsibility. Once again, I don't think this is just the responsibility of a public service broadcaster, but I think it's the responsibility of all news outlets to offer robust and strong internships. And we know that there was some announcements that the 2021 internships for the ABC were cancelled because due to bushfires and coronavirus, and we'll be getting those internships back on for 2022 as they improve the program. But there does need to be funding there for good quality journalism, and that actually encourages and fosters young people and creators to get into the industry as well. That's once again, that's just not to the creed of the public broadcaster, but I think that's a responsibility of all news outlets as well. And one other thing that I think another solution is to involve a lot of younger people in that, as I said, in that sort of 12 to sort of 15 sort of age group. We tried to do that last year during last year's Media Literacy Week, where we had a News Champions Forum that we ran in conjunction with the Museum of Australian Democracy. It was funded by, it was a Google News initiative, and a group of young people from all around Australia, from ages from about 8 to 15, met in Canberra to sort of talk about how they sort of saw themselves in the news and how they could actually participate more meaningfully in the news. So I think more programs like that could be, you know, helpful, tangible solutions to some of the concerns that were raised in the report.
Thanks, Annabel. That's a brilliant summary of our recommendations and leaves us with just under 10 minutes to throw to our audience. And I've seen a few questions coming through. So the first one, which I'll actually hand to Sophie, and that Molly alluded to in her response, was that when linking the media and young people, how do we make sure that they're portrayed in a positive way so that it isn't a disempowering experience for the young person who's interviewed? So I wondered, Sophie, if you could talk one of the positive experiences you've had and how that went, or what kind of strategies implemented to make it a great experience for you.
Probably unsurprisingly, I have had really, really good experiences with Triple J. It's very engaged with young people and the issues that we're talking about. And I think the major thing is almost every time I've done any type of media, aside from Triple J, a question is always tagged on at the end, which is usually something like, you know, a lot of young people are you know, young people get called snowflakes. How do you respond to this? Or there's something negative always tacked on just to, and it sort of feels like they're trying to get a reaction. And recently, when all of that stuff was blowing up with Ida Buttrow's comments about young people being lazy, I was on ABC Brekkie, and the youth unemployment at that time had just skyrocketed to over 16%, where it is at the moment. And we only had a few minutes, and I was just shocked that I would even be asked to respond to those questions when we were in the midst of talking about this huge crisis of youth unemployment, and I'm being asked to respond to how lazy young people are. And I said that when I was asked the question, and that's something that I have never experienced with an organisation like Triple J. And I think it comes down to that they have so many more young people engaged in the background of putting the show together and understanding the perspective. And when I've got onto the show, I've never felt like they're trying to get some sort of reaction based on these biases that we have around young people. And I think that's probably a good place to start, to look into ourselves and the biases that we have when we're engaging with young people.
Thanks, Soph. The second question we've got, which I might ping to you, Shahni, is about how much this lack of representation, or the problem with lack of representation of young people in media, is down to ignorance as opposed to intention. So do we think there's more at play in the projection and publication of bias and the omission of voices?
I think it would be a combination of the two, you know. It's obviously you have a case-by-case basis, but historically, like, I think the editorial processes that we have, you know, even when it comes to the person that's doing the storytelling, usually you have two people above you that is saying that it should be written a certain way, or the deadline, you know, has these confinements. And, you know, you might do all the work to get young people in a story, and then they say, oh, you've only got a minute and a half instead of 2. We're going to cut the young people that you've spent all day trying to put into your story. So sometimes it is a collaborative effort, but half the time, you know, intention, it's also about having a workplace where you feel safe enough to speak up about, you know, when ignorance is coming into play, and the intention is very clearly that they don't want to include these voices. And it's also about being in a space where you feel like you can actually stand up and talk to people. So these are all very massive structural issues that our workplaces and us as journalists are trying to deal with. And I think this kind of point, the environment we're in is a place where journalists are kind of seeing more power to stand up to the structural stuff that we're seeing. You know, we're having reports being made that we can reference now. And hopefully all these things about having, you know, more young people within our workplaces and having the opportunities, you know, the cadetships. And I was I did Haywire. I was a small plug. And it was great by having these programs, and hopefully that this can filter through, because it can be a combination of ignorance and intent, but at the same time, the more of us that there are in these places and the more representation we have, like we can't give up the battle, I don't think, because even though we feel like, you know, just by going out and getting the stories and getting the talent, the right talent that you think should be in the story being young people, and then they get cut, I feel like that the intent shouldn't outweigh the work that we're still doing, even though it can be disheartening for both the talent, for the journalists sometimes, that you know, these are the structures that we exist within. But it seems, you know, from looking at today and the work being done by the people in the panel, the people that have tuned in, the people, you know, the Izzy and your mob that's putting the report together, that we're recognising that this is an issue, and we can't let that ignorance and intent outweigh the hard work that we still need to do to get better.
Couldn't have picked a better line to end us on, and I think that call to arms and a broader one is really important as well. The recommendations in the report certainly don't seek to single out the media and acknowledge that there is a role for everyone to play. We are approaching 1:15, so at this point I'll close out the panel, but like to say thank you so much again to our wonderful 6 panellists who've joined us: Annabel, Astbury, Tarek Goodwin, Shahni, Wellington, Patrick, Lenton, Sophie, Johnston and Molly George. We'd also, as I said, everyone has a role to play in helping raise youth voice, whether it's, you know, writing a letter to your editor or making a complaint when you feel like an article didn't represent someone accurately. There are courses, there are actions you can take for recourse. But as of today, let me share my screen again, we're calling on you to download the report, to get familiar with its findings and pass it on. And we'll be emailing a version of this, the final version, out to you with the recording of the event. And I don't think there was too many more questions, but if we missed one, please let us know and we will endeavour to answer it and send you the response. We'd love for you to share your thoughts on youth representation. What does it mean? When have you seen it done well? When have you seen it done poorly? Whether you want to kickstart a conversation, drop that on social media, or write it in a letter to the editor. As I said, let's get talking about this in a really serious way and have that conversation with us. That invitation certainly isn't just for the media, but we very much hope that this research will be a baseline for future research on how to do better, how to include more young people and their voices, and to make sure we've got a really participatory and active media. So finally on this slide is, if you have follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. You can contact me directly via this email. And on that note, I thank you all very much for joining us in the report launch and wish you the best herein.